And our next speaker is Jordan Shaw. He's an artist and creative technologist, raised and based right here in Toronto. Jordan's art attempts to visualize the hidden interactions between people and technology, data collection, and the digital systems trying to understand the physical world. So this should be very interesting. His art has exhibited across Canada and internationally in Australia, Germany, Spain, and the United States. So please welcome to the stage Jordan Shaw.
Thank you. Hey everyone. Yeah, thanks for coming today. The topic of my presentation here is how to get what you want out of AI-generated images. Thank you, Jason. So you kind of like went through and did this intro. That's fine. So we'll just kind of skip through this slide. So how did we sort of like end up, or how did I end up here talking about this this topic? This here is like an example of the first AI-generated image that I did back in 2015. It was a style transfer, if those sort of remember the hype around that when it came out. And it was done locally on my computer. It took 3 to 6 hours of running just to get this like small 6-inch by 6-inch printable image. But what it did was it got me hooked on machine learning and sort of some data science and generative image creation. And it allowed for experimentation, because at the time, there were no services like we have today. So it was really fun to be able to have it localized on my computer, send it off, or start something, let it run overnight, as an example, and then sort of see what it creates when I wake up. So that was back in 2015. Things have changed dramatically at this point, and that brings us to today. Right now, there's like a radical decrease, I'm sure many of you are aware, with like the time that is required to generate these like extremely high fidelity images. This has allowed for like quicker visual studies, experimentation, faster iteration, and validation during like creative ideation processes. So from sort of like that point, what I've been really like fascinated about and sort of looking at is focusing sort of the image generation on text, typography, emojis, natural materials, close-ups, and recently as well, vintage photography and like hybrid architecture. The sort of choice of these themes and topics, for me anyway, are because I found that they're typically the areas that these large image models have like the most difficulty generating good output. And because of that, as an artist, I'm really fascinated with sort of like poking around and challenging and trying to push the boundaries of what can be created and like and figuring out where those boundaries are, and perhaps maybe finding some unique and interesting byproducts of that. So what we're going to do today for intentional image generation and talking about that, we'll sort of look at like a cultural context. We'll look at how to think about it as setting intentions before your project, deciding on a platform that would suit your project best, wordsmithing, and then sort of like the future and some additional resources. So it might be very apparent at this point, but I think it's still worth talking slightly about is like, why does all of this matter? I think it's really interesting, the adoption and the hype, if you say hype, or if you can say hype, about how this has really sort of have become like entrenched in society and like popular culture at this point. Within a number of months, and even looking back at the last 2 weeks, there's been massive and huge movements forward in the technologies, the availability, the adoption across like creatives in that sort of environment, but as well larger organizations and platforms as well. So I think the other important part, and perhaps why so much attention and I guess perspective or opinions from the public have started to appear, is with the release and the availability of platforms like DALL, Stability, and Stable Diffusion, and Midjourney. It has really allowed the public to experiment and understand and help grasp the significance of AI-generated content. And because of that, it gave the larger public access to all of these tools and to really viscerally understand the impact that this technology can have going forward, and perhaps even the scary part of it is how it's going to impact their current lives based on sort of the history of their skill sets or processes. But I think it's also a pretty beautiful thing to consider that these tools that were once a number of years ago very difficult to even set up and generate on your computer and run and get any sort of decent output is now accessible to so many people for experimentation and learning. I think that sort of fosters a mindset on a much larger scale of creativity, innovation, and that sort of stuff. While there are a lot of sort of critiques as well, that I'm going to try to focus on sort of intentional image generation, and perhaps later today in our panel discussion we can talk of some of the nuanced challenges and criticisms that these technologies have as well. So also to kind of add a little bit more context, I've found for my work Midjourney is the platform that I find most important or most useful for what I'm looking to create. Because of this, a lot of the themes and the subject matter that I'm going to talk about as we go through is sort of through the lens of Midjourney. However, within the last 2 weeks, Midjourney has sort of revamped and completely changed how prompting works. So I'm going to try to balance between the algorithm versions 1 through 4 and version 5, which is newly sort of a whole new sort of syntax and paradigm when wordsmithing or prompting. And actually each sort of algorithm we'll go through it too has its own pros and cons and its own purposes too, I found, through a creative lens. So moving on to setting up, thinking about your projects and being intentional with prompting and AI image generation. The first thing is sort of understanding and maybe writing down what your intentions are creatively, visually, and perhaps collaboratively as well. Some questions that I find most helpful for me when starting a project is, I sit down and sort of think about these specifically, is if I'm just playing around or exploring, so perhaps being an AI flaneur, and also what the images will be used for. So what is the desired output? Is it going to be used for digital art or perhaps NFTs or something, prints, stock photography, concept images, storyboards, visual communication, or other forms of storytelling? The sort of next thing is a little bit more on the technical side, but it's what's the image requirements in perhaps size, dimensions, resolutions that I need for the project. Next also is on a stylistic point of view, does it matter, or do I have a vision that aligns more to a realist or conceptual style? Because that's going to help me decide and pick either which algorithm to use within Midjourney, or perhaps even Stable Diffusion or DALL. So I think the other part of setting intentions, and I think it's a really fascinating and interesting space, is how integrating generative images into an already creative process. So here, as an example, what I've started to do is using Midjourney to create scenes and environments for like public art and installation proposals. It can help foster, or it can help like solidify narrative and feelings about the piece that you're proposing or the piece that you want to create. And then it also has like a level of efficiency. As an example here, the sort of sunshade public structure bench sculpture that I was proposing, it was for a location a couple hours north of Toronto. So rather than driving up or using Google Maps or trying to find like a similar open or stock photography image of the location, I was able to prompt what I was looking for and then set it in or use it as a complement with the proposal. So I think rather than thinking of sort of image generation is going to completely or largely sort of replace maybe creative people, artists or designers or illustrators or whatever, I think it's important to consider and think about how these tools might actually end up being used as tools rather than replacements for those skills. And then sort of, as we're talking about version 3 and version 4, or version 1, 2, 3, 4, and then version 5 of Midjourney. In the last 2 weeks, I've kind of gone back and reprompted with a new version of Midjourney. And as an example, like same prompt, different algorithm, like this is like what I got instead. And there's definitely merit with a different aesthetic, but I think it demonstrates the point of knowing what the outputs of those different algorithms are can really benefit and add value to whatever your creative project is and whatever the intention is that you have for generated images. Next, when thinking about intentions and like integrating it into creative processes, a creative team of mine, or a creative team that are friends of mine, they were telling me about they've started to use image prompts to better communicate as a team back and forth during like the ideation process. They found that it sort of forced them to be a little bit more explicit in how they're describing things, but then as well it allows for easy visual representation of maybe more complex visuals and narratives. So I think that's like really cool as well, because not only does it allow people to, I guess, at first, the initial sort of like thought is, oh, these technologies or these platforms are going to like replace creative teams. Creative teams might not even be using them for the final output. They're using them to better articulate and collaborate together before the final product or before the final project. And then lastly, like these technologies are like incredibly industry changing. I think. What seemed like a fast pace a couple months ago is nothing like the last 2 weeks. But as an example, from project proposals and setting up or creating a lot of background images for like creative works for like that look like art galleries, loft spaces, warehouses, public parks, and squares, I sort of collected a large number of these sort of like stock photo-looking images. I submitted them to Shutterstock because like why not? I thought all were rejected. Then like no kidding, like 2 days later, I saw that like Shutterstock like directly integrated with OpenAI. So it was like pretty funny because there was a little bit of like, oh, I was on point with like the concept and idea. However, a little bit late to the game maybe, or not big, like yeah. But the other thing is worthwhile noting right now, too, is how it's industry changing. There is a big difference in organizations and how they view this technology. So there's currently like a lawsuit that you can look up online as well if you haven't already heard of it or heard about it, with Getty Images and Stable Diffusion. And that is an organization that has a very different viewpoint than, say, what seems Shutterstock has with the direct integration with one of these platforms. So once you have your sort of intention set, or you start thinking about how these tools can be integrated into your own creative process, it's time to pick what platform it is you want to use. We'll go through some of the three main ones. If you have any questions about these that are up on the screen right now, you can come talk to me after. But we'll focus on DALL-E 2, Stability AI and Stable Diffusion, and Midjourney at this point. When picking a platform for the project, I think the thing, before you start the project or make a decision, what you really want to do is sort of like have these like fleshed out. So I would recommend considering and thinking about, will the work be used commercially or not? Does your project need to interface with any other systems or APIs? Do you need to easily access these files later on? So does it matter if it's hosted on the platform's own servers, or do you want it hosted somewhere else, like Google Drive, where you have more control over that data, or even just exporting them and saving them effectively locally? Next, it's worth considering, like, is community and sharing your output important to you in the project? And are you interested in more of a realism or abstract or conceptual output? And then finally, it's worth thinking about, because it does make an impact, what are the requirements for like image size, dimensions, and so on, DPI, if it's going to print. So as a sort of quick high-level overview, as we look at sort of DALL-E, images tend to be more realistic. They can be found to be a little less conceptual. So there's a bit more of like a literal interpretation of the natural language processing algorithms that it's doing, which kind of makes sense given the other services that OpenAI have. It is a token-based payment system, and then there's a little bit, but not too much, like social and community interaction built into the platform. From the technical side, it's 1024 by 1024, supports like image variations. DALL-E was also, I believe, it was the first instance or first platform that I saw doing in-painting and out-painting, which would give direct ability to edit what the image output was, which was really cool. And then also, it has a publicly available API for easy integration into other software or platforms or whatnot, depending on what you're doing. On to Stable Diffusion. This ecosystem is completely open sourced, which means there's you have access to the code base, which is awesome. It also means that there's been implementations that vary widely across like the internet. There's so many different instances that behave in different ways that you can see, but however, it's also allowing for people to kind of push the boundaries of what can be done with diffusion models. There's a huge community with Stable Diffusion that exists around the Discord, GitHub, Google Colab, and Hugging Face. And then, you have more options for saving data and output. Because it's open source, you can run it locally or on your servers, and you have a bit more control. And that sort of takes us to Midjourney. So looking at what the sort of system requirements are for versions 1 through 4. Midjourney definitely tends to lean a little bit more conceptual. It can be influenced by specific documentation or specific documented syntaxes and parameters. Monthly subscriptions in different price tiers. Very social on Discord, and there is sort of like a user dashboard that's available. It supports like really large image outputs, like up to 2,000 pixels, which is awesome. And you can jam and collaborate with other users online. There's no API currently at the moment either. Looking at version 5 of Midjourney's algorithm, they're hinting at eventually or potentially releasing a public API, which is pretty cool. We'll see that. But the big overhaul with version 5 is that it leans, I've noticed anyway, it leans much more photorealistic, and it prefers more sentence-based prompts rather than syntax and syntax hacking. which is a bit of a paradigm shift to think about. So onto some, I guess, like wordsmithing tips and some recommendations and learnings from my experimentation and work. So kind of like, as I was saying, like thinking about version 5, it's even like more important to be descriptive. Version 5 is more descriptive to be able to articulate and get the proper output that you're looking for. So I tend to find that thinking about your prompts in sort of like a software development mindset, like object-oriented programming, can be really interesting, which is a reference to sort of, I guess, like trying to articulate that. It would be, think of like the different aspects within your scene that you want in your output, and focus on describing each one of those objects in almost like a succinct, like packaged way, and then sort of string them together in a sentence or paragraph, rather than sort of jumping all over the place. If you don't get what you would like, rewording and rephrasing is important. And then I think also think about the different creative styles and aspects that you want. So like describe the scene as explicitly as possible. And then also what's really helpful, I found, is using jargon. Well, it can be sort of obscure in a conversational way. For working with such large, I guess, like language models that are doing the interpretation, it's panned out to be quite helpful. So for me, in my exploration, in my work, using words and terms like Perlin noise, or algorithms like Perlin noise, and concepts like flow fields, metaballs, plexus, and particles and stuff work really well to getting really dynamic and interesting output. Looking at version 4, 1 through 4, as I was sort of saying, you can break apart your ideas and prompts with sections. Typically, periods and commas are soft breaks, double colons are hard breaks, and then you can weight the double colon like prompt breaks with like say like 1 to 10, which is pretty helpful. So you can sort of like guide and maneuver what that output would be. The difference with version 5 of the Midjourney algorithm is they sort of got away or moved away from that sort of prompt syntax. I've found anyway, those syntax that I mentioned on the previous slide, they do still have influence, especially the multi-prompts with the double colons, but they have a little bit less of an impact or influence on what the output is. But what they're really focusing on is almost like a creative writing style of prompt. So almost sometimes like obnoxiously descriptive. And as a side note, I feel anyway, you can sort of see how all of this is lining up to start to implement or start to support like more dynamic prompting coming from ChatGPT. So perhaps like a small prompt to ChatGPT would allow for a much more elaborative and accepting, image prompt that would be passed into Midjourney. Some other things, like I talked about before, about the value and the differences between the different Midjourney algorithms and how they do have specific pros and cons. What I've noticed is like version 1 and 2, it tends to lean a little bit more in the sci-fi space. Version 3 is pretty well-rounded, medium-high level of detail, nothing like version 5, but still pretty good. Version 4, you can get pretty good stylized aesthetics. Like I talked about before, how I was using version 4 algorithms for background images for proposals, and then also making use of the documented parameters that Midjourney supports. So aspect ratio, image weights, and how sort of like creative, or I think they have like chaos, you want that your output to be given liberty to the algorithm itself. With the version 5 algorithm, Definitely, without a doubt, it is more photorealistic, which has kind of been like a bit of a pain, to tell you the truth, for me. But you explicitly have to specify that you want Midjourney to use version 5. It also, as with my experimentation, it does worse at creating text output, but version 5 does solve the I guess hilarity in the problem of hands. So in the past image generations, hands and fingers were terrible, like funny. So that seems to be resolved pretty well. So moving on, I wanted to give some examples of like how jargon works really well. So rewording your prompt to use jargon, here's an example of trying to get a tree in the shape of an S, more or less, and you get something like this, which is like just funny knowing the prompt, but like bad. And it reminded me of this like skill that's used in a very niche way of growing trees over like a 40-year process to shape what the tree grows into, and it's typically used to create furniture. But having to research again and refine what this term is in its arbor sculpture, adding that sort of jargoned word into the prompt allowed for something a little bit more along the lines that I was looking for, like this, or even like this. Next, sort of like going on into like exploration with like text-specific prompts, specifically sort of looking at versions like 1 through 4, like I would say even maybe 4 for the quality. Having the word that you want in the output, starting with that word. So have that first even brackets written word, helps guide that output, and making sure that the word that you're trying to get as an output is appropriately sized or the appropriate length to the aspect ratio that you're requesting from Midjourney to output to. So a word like skateboard, don't have that in like a 1x1 image. It won't fit, and you won't get the output that you're wanting. And then lastly, a really good recommendation too is if you're struggling getting the word that you want, using Midjourney's like support of image prompts or like clip guidance is really good. So if you want a specific word, you can almost think of like think of it like masking almost. Create an image with that word. You can upload that to Midjourney. Start with that as the image prompt, and then combine that with a more descriptive like style that you want on top of it. And I've found that has helped get letters and words to come out a little bit more succinctly. So looking actually at the combination and differences between version 4 and version 5 of text generation that I've sort of been exploring. This is version 4. This is version 5. It like looks more realistic in version 5, however, a little bit more obscure and abstract. Not as clear. So version 4, version 5, and these are all based on like pretty much the same prompt. And to get version 4, not too bad, but like version 5, it's definitely much easier to get single letter outputs than full words though. Version 4 hints of sort of like tech as a word in there. Version 5, and then as I mentioned before, some explorations into like hybrid architecture. Just sharing these to show like the photorealism that can happen with version 5, and then some photography from version 5 as well, and like demonstrating that hands are a little less off than in the past. There's a lot that's still going on. The last 2 weeks have been super fast paced, but there's more coming now with Adobe Firefly. Runway ML has released their Gen 2 paper for video, etc. Some other sort of exploration types that using Stable Diffusion that I've experimented with, come and talk to me after if you're interested in these with video, 3D images, and using, or video 3D models and getting those models into XR experiences. So the 4 takeaways from today that I think is really worth to consider, and I hope you kind of remember these when you're prompting and working on projects and integrating diffusion models in image generation into your projects, is start by setting your intentions and what you want. Pick the platform based on what the project intentions are and the final use of those images. Be descriptive and rephrase. Be creative with syntax, punctuation, and prompt weights if necessary. Experiment with images and clip guidance. And then lastly, just sort of like have fun and like leave a little bit of space open to fill in and allow for the collaboration with the algorithms as a whole. Once again, I can sort of share some of these links if anyone is interested as well. And yeah, thank you. I hope everyone found this helpful and useful. So,
thank you. Thanks, Jordan.
No problem.
If you want to have a seat,
sure.
We'll have a little talk. We'll check out some of the questions they've been coming in. Here's one that I wanted to ask. And if you have any other questions while we're talking, go to fitc.ca/questions and ask away, and they'll pop up right here on my phone. So here's a question again from Ben. It seems like we need to start to build an almost encyclopedic level of knowledge of different concept styles, artists, technical specifications, jargon, and more. We were talking about this yesterday, just like, you know, if you're into photography, what lenses, what's the f-stop, what are all the settings? How do you go about growing your knowledge in these different spaces? How do you research what it is that you want to actually present, or what you want Midjourney to present?
Good question. I've been having it in the back of my mind as like a to-do to create like a resource for that specifically. I haven't yet, but I think there's definitely value. There's definitely value to that. But I also really feel that there's something interesting about having an idea and still having like a human component of trying to figure out how to work with it and how to get the output that you envision or see. So I guess like as an example, with sort of like arbor sculpture and sort of exploring like text outputs in sort of natural forms, I have gone that you sort of like there has to be a word that describes X. So like tree sculptures.
So you asked ChatGPT.
I actually haven't tried that, but I have done like hilariously long stretches of like Googling and trying to read about like what is a word that best describes what this vision or thought is that I have. And that is, yeah. So.
Do you have any secret weapons or sites that you go to that have some fantastic sort of prompt dictionaries or resources for prompting?
There's a few. I forget the name. This is bad. I forget the name. Sorry?
Prompt space?
Base? Okay.
Base. Prompt base.
I'll check that out. I found a few like Google, like collaborative public Google spreadsheets that sort of try to like automate that. I've experimented with that, but they sort of just like, it's such a huge list. It's almost like overwhelming to like source through, right? So from like a creative perspective, I try to like get influence honestly from sort of like the physical world in space and that, and then bring that into what I want to do.
It also changes so fast. I mean, like you just showed, going from Midjourney V4 to V5,
Yeah.
all of a sudden the prompting is almost in a completely different language. I mean, it's using more natural language as opposed to getting more into the technical jargons and separating things with commas and...
Yeah, and I have tried Chat GPT output into Midjourney, and it just feels like I'm facilitating computer output. Like I have I feel there's no feeling of like I feel anyway like creativity just taking an output, a text output, and like putting it into here, because it seems that within like the near future that there's going to be APIs that are going to be doing that, or a service that's going to be doing that with Midjourney.
That's a good point. How do you get the particular angles that you want from the landscape photos that you showed, or the landscape renderings?
Researching photography styles and techniques, different lenses and apertures and levels of detail and stuff. And then even just like looking at like the library of photos that I've taken from like traveling across Canada or other parts of the world too. So like using other forms of creativity or creative output that I've done in the past as influence.
It really feels like as a creator, you almost have to do a lot more work to get some of these things out of the image generation, than almost learning the craft and making it yourself. One of the questions here is a question I've had often too, but do you know of any way of bringing generative artwork into any other formats? Specifically, vector was one of the questions. Where you could play with it in Figma or...
I was going to say
3D?
There was I alluded to it quickly, but like Stable Diffusion to 3D models, I think is a really interesting place that this is going to go. And while experimenting with that, like during the process of exploring typography, for whatever reason, I was like, the letter J, and I ended up with like this sort of wonky 3D model. I was like, I bet if I clean it up a little bit, I could get this 3D printed. And like, sure enough, like if anyone wants to see this after, it's just like very strangely perspectived, like 3D model that was purely created from AI. And I think that's really fascinating. And like stuff like this will be cleaned up, but like it's weird that this came from nothing.
Right.
Really,
yeah,
right?
Yeah.
And it's not correct necessarily, but I think as like an art piece or like an art object is fascinating. And then stuff like this can be easily implemented into like XR experiences or other sort of like 3D environments.
That's cool. I thought that was a mouth guard for a second when you...
No, that would have been weird. That just...
It's all weird. All of this stuff is crazy. I was going to ask, another question here is around copyright.
Yes.
Now, let's even just setting aside the whole idea of, where are these GANs and systems getting their images from? What about your own images? What's your thoughts on the things that you're creating and whether or not they belong in the public sphere, or whether you can copyright them as Jordan, or see, I got his name right. What's your take on that?
That's a good question. I've thought quite a bit about that, and I think from like me as an artist's perspective, I would tend to be more protective of the output of installation or sculptural work that I've done, or other like creative coding or generative work that has a bit more, maybe it's not a good descriptor, but a bit more of like a manual or tangible input from me, knowing where these platforms have sourced their images, and that's like we could have long conversations about the ethics of that. Anything that I've sort of like created with, say, Midjourney, I've almost just sort of accepted that it's sort of online in this like open public sphere that's a little bit murky. I talked about the sort of stock photography, fake stock photography that I tried to submit to a stock photography site that was declined. It was declined, but then I packaged that up, I put it online, and I like just clearly said like fully transparent, like open source. Anyone can do whatever they want with these. It's there for anyone. So I think it's still a pretty complicated topic, but I sort of weaver back and forth depending on what I'm doing creatively.
So you're almost saying that the more labor that you put into it, the more labor intensive it is, the more it's yours, the more you own it?
Personally, yes, that is sort of
Sure.
my own opinion.
Fair.
As I was saying that, I was thinking about the countless hours of like searching online for specific words, and that's definitely laborious. But I think that's like my own personal perspective, a little bit of work.
So I think we have time for one more question. Tech Romancer wants to know how you refine a prompt in Midjourney or other platforms to correct the areas that aren't working for you. So for example, if it messes up an item that you want a character to be holding, do you use Stable Diffusion to do in-painting or out-painting? Or how do you play around with changing bits that you want changed?
I have experimented with like in and out painting. It's not a process that I typically do. I typically try to reword what I am trying, like reword that prompt, or prioritize the order of descriptors that are in that prompt. So if something's not coming out right, the thing that's not coming out right, it makes me double check and reflect on, oh, if I'm concerned that this is wrong, it's probably more important in the actual output than I originally thought, so I might move that earlier on or closer to the beginning of the prompt, and then I would also maybe like double or triple index the description of that. So I might have say a person holding a water bottle. If that's not correct, I would maybe describe that at the beginning and re-describe it in a different way at the end.
So say it more than once, and sort of create a version of waiting.
Yes. Yeah.
One quick question we'll slip in. Given the current resolution limits, how useful do you find images for high quality commercial use? I guess you can upscale and things like that in Photoshop, but how do you approach that?
You can upscale in Photoshop. There's also AI software that allows you to like upscale to like with pretty good quality. I would say quite good quality.
Like Blade Runner style computer enhance.
Yeah, mind you, I've really done. I've done that for art prints, and then I've done that when I was trying to submit stock photography, and I think I ended up. So it was something stupid like 30,000 pixels. It was maybe that's why it was declined. It's too big.
Okay.
But yeah, I typically try to use those like up-res or enhance platforms.
Well, I think we've reached that time. Thank you so much for your talk and for the Q&A. Yeah, let's give another round of applause for